Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hey everyone, Mikki here, and this week on the podcast I speak to José Areta, lecturer in sports nutrition and metabolism, about energy availability. We talk about what it is, and specifically about his paper around within-day energy availability in cyclists and the variation both between athletes and also in the same athlete. We talk about the definition, why it's important, and also some aspects of energy availability that we think might be true for all might not necessarily have the science to back that up. So Jose and I have a really good discussion in and around what we know, what is speculation, and sort of where the research is headed to help either confirm or bring up other aspects of energy availability that we may not necessarily be aware of. So this interview, in fact, featured on Fitter Radio a few weeks ago. José Areta currently works as a lecturer in sports nutrition and metabolism at the School of Sport and Exercise Sciences at Liverpool John Moores University. His primary interest is in the area of training nutrient interactions in humans. In other words, he investigates how to manipulate ingestion of carbohydrates, fat, and protein around training to optimize physical performance and health. We have a link to where you can find Jose and also the paper that he and I discuss in today's podcast over on the show notes. And before we crack on into the interview, just a reminder that the best way to support the podcast is to hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast listening platform. That increases the visibility of Mikkipedia out there in amongst the literally thousands of other podcasts, so more people get the opportunity to learn from the guests that I have on the show. Righto, on to this week's interview with José Areta about energy availability. Yeah, that's cool. Are you a runner, Jose?
No,
Per se.
I used. Yeah, you pronounce it right. Don't worry. I've been living in different countries and I've been called all sort of different things. So we understand you. Don't worry.
Okay,
it's pretty good.
That's good. Yeah.
No, look, I don't do any sports competitively, but I've done sports competitively all my life. I suppose this last thing I did like semi-seriously was road cycling. In which I was competing sort of like national level in like when I was in Australia, like never really was in the national road series, but competing at, with some of those guys. And also when I was in Norway, I did quite a few races of the national circuit and stuff. So, and earlier, I did many years of Taekwondo, very, very different. There was like black belt in Taekwondo. So I was competing at national level back in Argentina, where I'm from.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I've done a range of sports. Most of the times competitively, but now I do whatever I can fit in my schedule, really.
Totally. And actually, that almost leads into really our discussion today, because a lot of your research is done in cyclists, actually. And one of the first times I saw your name, I remember you had published a case study on a cyclist who was injured, and then you brought her back from injury, and there was just issues of low energy availability, which of course we're going to be talking about as well. So is that where your interest in sort of studying cyclists has come from, or are they just an easy cohort to get?
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose it's a bit of a mix. I really like cycling. One of the reasons why I really got into cycling, it was because I could get a power meter, so I could measure everything. So when I got a power meter, I was like, oh my God, this is great. You can see all your training load, you can understand, you can derive so many things and relate them to physiology and, having access to a lab and a power meter and so on. I started really thinking about training and training load in a different way. So really for me, cycling, for the number of years that I was dedicated to it, it was more of a numbers game, and it was more the fun of like understanding how to improve your 5-minute power, your 20-minute power, and so on. it's so related to physiology, and nutrition to me is so related to physiology that I was like, oh, this is great. So from the let's say sports nutritionist perspective, or I don't know if I can call myself a sports nutritionist, but from my perspective of someone who works in trying to understand how humans adapt to exercise and how nutrition plays a role, then that is really a great model, because you can quantify a lot of things. You can you see a lot of extremes as well, like very high energy expenditure, very high training load, high intensity, in which carbohydrate fueling and so on makes a massive difference. So and when you experience it firsthand, and you notice the difference that things make, you go like, oh yeah, this does really make a difference. Also, when you have the chance to measure a lot of these things in the lab, for example, and see, what difference that does it make when you're measuring it properly, and so on. So, I suppose it's hard to say what was first, if the chicken or the egg, But I'm very much involved in cycling. I typically get cyclists reach out to me to do different type of work for the nutrition, and I used to coach cycling as well, and yeah. But I've got experience like well beyond cycling.
Yeah, for sure. And it certainly sounds like it with your sort of history of athletics and sport. Jose, one of my questions actually, and I might kick off here and then come back to low energy, and then we can define low energy availability, but just up front, like, can we trust what the power meter tells us about energy expenditure? Or what about the watches that some athletes use? Like, how much of that information is maybe gospel, if that's the right word, or how much of it do we need to sort of allocate a level of error about that? Because I find it quite confusing.
Yeah, you're not alone, I must say. So I think we need to reflect on this, on what it actually means to measure energy expenditure and energy intake. Really, it comes down to that. I think it's very important, to consider, well, first of all, what do we want to measure and why? That's the first question that we should ask ourselves, and then think about how accurate the measurements are. So, if we're working with cyclists and we have these athletes having, day in and day out, they're training only on bikes, and you have power meter data, which measures direct mechanical power. So it's basically measuring how much force you're putting on the pedals, and then multiplying that torque by how many revolutions per minute, and so on, and you can get an idea of the mechanical power in joules, in joules per second, in watts, and then you can sort of have an estimate of what is the metabolic power that is generated, so how many kilocalories you are using. So the relationship is quite linear, as the studies that are out there are showing that the relationship between the mechanical power and the metabolic energy expenditure is very, very similar. So it's a very, very good way of having an idea of how much energy you might be expending. The thing is that there's, of course, between individual variability of how much energy, or what's the relationship between the mechanical power and the actual energy expenditure. Now, power meters are best case scenario because it's a very direct measurement of what's, how much force you're putting on the pedal. Percentage more, percentage less, like a few percentage difference might be, between different people, but the difference is not that big. So it's a pretty good way of measuring energy expenditure. All the other ways of measuring energy expenditure, I would say, unless it's a more direct thing like down level water, which is you have like total energy expenditure measurements. It's a different sort of animal when it comes to estimating energy expenditure. It's a lot more expensive. You can do it for periods of like a week and so on. But other than that, all the other measurements of energy expenditure, I would say they're worse typically than using a power meter.
Yeah.
So when you're using your and I'm not an expert in energy expenditure assessment, but I know these things because of what I'm involved in.
Of course.
But there's a lot of error that this is something that people tend to forget. There's a lot of error. There's a lot of a lot of equipment is not reliable. So if you do the same thing twice, doesn't measure it gives you two different measurements. And there's also the issue of accuracy. So how far it is from the actual measurement or the actual value. Yeah. And, different estimates can give you, or different types of devices and so on, gives you errors of like, I don't know, let's say 20%. Which is a lot, it's very, very, very much a lot. And this is only considering the energy expenditure. If we start thinking about the energy intake as well, you can have like an error of between like 20, 40%, depending on how the assessment of energy intake is done.
Yeah, totally.
So what I'm trying to say with all of these is that trying to measure some of these things really is a double-edged sword. When we're doing it in the lab and when we're doing it systematically with an athlete, we can have a better idea of, what's going on. We always know there's a little bit of error, but when you're trying to do this on your own at home, sort of like, don't try this at home kind of thing, like the error that you're going to get is probably going to be quite high.
Yeah. So with regards to, say, using your power meter, like it might say you've burnt 1,200 kilojoules, does that mean that I should then eat 1,200 kilojoules back? Or is some of that energy that might be burned from my intramuscular triglycerides or something? So I don't like that. I feel like people get confused a little bit by that. Jose, is that what your experience is?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's complicated, how the biology of body weight regulation and energy balance is very, very complex. So I think sometimes, these devices can help you guiding you in terms of like what your fueling strategies should be, how much energy you should have and from what. That doesn't mean that you have to go to the extent of doing like calorie per calorie, what your power meter is telling you've expended. Of course, you want to match, depending on the situation you are, and this is probably the first question that you should be asking yourself, is like, what do I want to achieve? Because different aims will require that you have different strategies on how you structure your nutrition. So one thing is, for example, for whatever reason, you want to lose some weight. For whatever reason, you want to train with low muscle glycogen, or for whatever reason, you want to have every single session with high carbohydrate availability. They are all valid aims, but you have to consider which aim you want to achieve at what time of the season. So this is very, very important. So whether you want to match that energy expenditure or not will depend on how, what you're aiming at. So I think this is very, very important to consider. Then when it comes to actually say, okay, I want to do the right thing and fuel correctly all the time, and by correctly, I mean like match the energy expenditure with the energy intake, then this is a consideration that you can start having, okay, yeah, this power meter or whatever device that I'm using is telling me this much. Then you ask yourself, okay, how accurate is this? And then you say, okay, this is quite accurate. Should I do it calorie by calorie and match it like, okay, based on my calculations, I have like 3,532 calories that I should be having. It's just a random number I made up in my head now. Yeah. And then you go like, oh, I got to match, by one. Yeah, I mean, mathematically that can be correct, but, we know that life gets in the middle. So, and also we know that our metabolism and the way our body uses energy changes based on, a range of things. And there are a lot of things that are difficult to quantify, like the NEAT. The NEAT is like a non-exercise energy expenditure. Or the NEAT actually stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And this is all the energy expenditure that you have during the day that is not what you do during exercise, that can account for a significant amount of energy expenditure. Of course, there's like, normal values for that, but that will change from person to person. What am I trying to say here? That it doesn't matter how good you are with your maths. Probably what you're trying to calculate is not going to be as good as what it actually is happening in the real life. So my point here, like, if you're trying to be like super obsessed about like every single calorie, you're probably, I'm not sure that's the best thing that you can do. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. There's a lot of other things you can't account for that makes it almost like an imperfect sort of science, I suppose.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yes, sometimes we have, the illusion of measurement or the illusion of accuracy, because we're taking a lot of things into consideration, but we have to keep in mind that we as biological systems have a lot of internal pathways of regulation that make us behave in different ways or adapt our metabolism so that things are not, this idea is a calorie, yeah, from a sort of thermodynamic standpoint, it is, but we as biological systems do a lot of different things that make it a bit more complex to calculate.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then this does lead into low energy availability as well, I suppose, because when an athlete is in a state of low energy availability, the calories that they might burn from the NEAT and other areas may well be reduced if they're not able to sort of meet the energy requirements of their particular sport. Would that be right?
Well, what happens? Well, first of all, we don't really know exactly what is low energy availability. I must say that. So in terms of how we define it, what is low energy availability? Is there a number? Is this like magic number, 30 kilocalories per kilo of fat-free mass per day? You're under that, and then you're like, low energy availability, watch out, avoid at all cost. It's not as simple as that. We know, how we define energy availability is the energy available to maintain physiological processes, or the energy from your energy intake, let's say, available for metabolic processes after you subtract the energy from exercise, spending in exercise. So that sounds very simple. So this is like what input energy there is for the system to maintain. And the idea is that, well, if you don't have enough, then your body is going to go into this sort of mode to try to save energy because it's detecting that it's not enough energy available. That's the theoretical definition, saying like, all right, neat, very, very clear, not enough energy, your body responds to that to try to survive in a state, where the energy available might not be enough. So that sounds very straightforward. When we start trying to calculate that and to say, well, when does the body start responding to that and what the responses are, things get a lot more complicated. Am I answering your question here?
No, you are, because of course you mentioned the 30 calories per kilogram of lean body mass, which is a number I've seen. So that there's more individual variation probably than what that number might tell us. Would that be correct?
Yeah, there's a lot of things really. So we have to go back to the origin of this number, I suppose, to try to understand what it means. So as I was saying before, this concept of energy availability comes from studies of mammals in nature, of basically about the reproduction of mammals in nature, particularly looking at female mammals and reproductive success, and how the reproductive system gets affected by lack of energy at certain times of the year in animals that are deprived because of like seasonal variation of food availability and so on. And so this then was taken into the lab to work with like rodents to try to understand what was actually happening. Then this was taken to humans, where it's kind of started being calculated, in very well-controlled laboratory studies, where they were like giving these young, human-erect, non-athletic females food in the form of like a liquid meals, giving them specific amount of energy, very, very well controlled over a period of 5 days, typically between 3 to 6 days.
Yeah.
Very well controlled energy expenditure. The studies are very neat, very clear, excellent physiology, but there are lab studies. Right, so everything is very well controlled over a short period of time. The assessment that they've done to see what's the effect of this energy availability is on sort of hormonal markers, that are very sensitive to the amount of energy available. So basically, is this in a way this is very artificial environment, which is very, very important to understand the physiology, but it has a lot of limitations to how we can translate that to the field. And there's a number of limitations there. One of them is that the duration of these studies is very, very short. We don't know what happens if you do this for a more prolonged period of time. Of course, logically, if you deductively, you would expect it to become worse and worse. Or maybe there's some sort of adaptation that makes that it doesn't get worse. So we don't really know. Then to what extent these sort of hormonal changes predict physiological differences, we're not 100% sure. What we know is that the hormonal changes in these short studies make these females a sort of hormonal milieu, like the hormonal environment, to look very similar to those of amenorrheic athletes.
Yeah.
So it's been associated to it being a negative thing. So is this idea, okay, if you're in like 5 days of low energy availability, then you see all these hormonal changes, it must be something bad. That is the connection that is typically being done in thinking, okay, then if you're under this threshold, then you might be in this situation where your hormonal profile is going, not in the right direction, sort of thing.
Yeah. So from there, then, of course, we've got, I guess, over the last few years, there's been much more acknowledgement that low energy availability is not just a female athlete issue, but obviously would affect male athletes as well. Is it? Am I correct in thinking that there may be some more resilience in male athletes compared to female athletes with regards to the amount of energy, despite the fact we're not sure of that actual number?
Yeah. I think, it's important to, when you look at, go back to more like what you call it, maybe epidemiological data, when you look at the frequency of stress fractures, for example, in females and males, sort of athletic or like more exercising population, the incidence in females is a lot higher. It's about 3 times as high as it is in males. Then it's been, energy availability has been linked to dysregulation of markers of bone metabolism. So there seems to be a link there whereby energy availability is directly affecting bone health. Apparently, I mean, that's what the evidence seemed to suggest. And as you're saying, then when we look at, or different studies look at changes in markers of bone metabolism in between males and females and energy availability, it appears that males are a little bit more resilient to it. So, it appears that maybe females are more affected by it than males. So this idea of if there is a threshold, which I don't know if there is, because I think it's a lot more complex than that, it might be that for males that threshold might be lower, but we don't really have conclusive evidence saying, well, that is the case.
Yeah, okay.
It seems that is, it's definitely a lot harder to detect in males, because one of the things that is also associated to low energy availability is the lack of a menstrual cycle or alteration of the menstrual cycle. So if you are eumenorrheic, you're bleeding on a regular basis, every 28 days or so, then what it might happen is that you become oligomenorrheic. So the length of the cycle changes by a lot more than is the typical variation, or it completely disappears. So this is a lot easier to spot in females and in males, of course, because males don't menstruate So there might be some sort of like reporting bias there. It's a lot harder to detect in males if there is an effect. There's some things that are associated to low energy availability, which is a decrease in testosterone, for example, but then the decrease in testosterone is not quite clinical. So it's if you measure someone's testosterone after potentially a prolonged period of low energy availability, is still going to be within the clinical values, but it's going to be on the sort of in the low end. They call it like subclinical low testosterone. But that then can be through a range of factors. So we don't really know to what extent low energy availability directly affect this.
Yeah. And I suppose if any biomarker for it to then be sort of matched to other symptoms, these are other signs potentially outside of those biomarkers that may suggest low energy availability, like, poor sleep or mood or not able to recover properly and signs like that.
It's tempting, to relate low energy availability to a lot of negative things, but there's not a lot of evidence, to be honest, to do a direct link between these two things. I think we have to be careful, in terms of like how we associate one parameter to a range of different outcomes. And it might be tempting to think, low energy availability as this sort of evil force, that is out there to deter people from doing the best they can. And it might have a negative effect when it's inflicted in a pronounced way over a long period of time. But I think to what extent we can really link low energy availability to things like poor sleep or whatever, like depression and so on, we don't really have evidence to make a causative link between these two things. It might be they are associated. It might be that people that sleep badly, they, for whatever reason, they don't feel in the best way, and so then the causative effect goes the other way around. So I think, we need to be careful how we can attribute these sort of negative effects of low energy availability to a lot of different factors.
Such a good point, because that's exactly what I did. And then you called me out on it, which was awesome. Because, of course, what I see in my head is the relative energy deficiency in sport, that little circle with all the little red dots of how these are possibly linked. But and I mean, you're the expert in the field, and you're sort of suggesting that at this point in time, there's not robust evidence to point to any particular sort of situation that might be in fact what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's very important that we generate high quality evidence to find a causative link between two different things. Totally.
So speaking of high quality evidence, you published a paper recently on the patterns of energy intake and energy expenditure in cyclists and the variability. Can you, Jose, just sort of brief us on what you actually were looking for and what you found?
Yeah. So one of the things that I was interested was into looking at, to what extent athletes sort of compensate their energy intake when they have high energy expenditure on a sort of day-to-day basis. We took this group of 10 elite cyclists that of a team that I was doing work with, a Norwegian team, a very good team. Doesn't exist anymore now after COVID. But what we were interested in, or I was interested in, saying like, well, let's see what happens with these patterns of energy availability. I had already observed this exact same thing with individuals, but I just wanted to see, okay, if we sort of systematically collect the data as part of the data collection that we do with the team, then we can have a better idea of, what's going on, and maybe given the numbers of athletes that we have a better idea of, what's characterized this sort of patterns. Also, trying to look at, this idea that, well, if your energy expenditure is high, then you are more likely to be in low energy availability sort of thing. So this is, how do you say, like an idea that has been out there for quite a while, saying like, well, athletes that have higher volume of training, particularly about like 10, 11 hours a week, are more likely to have, stress fractures, I'm referring to runners here, more likely to have like stress fractures and so on. So there was some sort of indirect linking between, higher training loads and likelihood of underfueling sort of thing. And I was like, let's see if we can generate some more direct evidence looking at what happens between these two factors. What happens when these individuals exercise, and these are a very good cohort to look at that, because the range of exercise energy expenditure that we have in these athletes is massive day to day. We have days that they don't rest, where they have like 0 kilocalories exercise energy expenditure. Most days they did at least a little exercise, but the range is between like 0. And some days, they did a 6-hour hard training ride and they have like over, 4,000 calories or plus energy expenditure. So you go like, the day-to-day variation was massive. So we collected data in these individuals, in these athletes, day after day in a very, very detailed way. So we had their power meter data when we did this method. This is called like remote food photography method. So athletes take a photo of everything of what they eat. So we have like a group of let's say like a WhatsApp group with 3 individuals, like the athlete and 2 researchers, who are like following all the meals that the athletes are having, meal by meal, or like any snack, anything, like it's like recorded. And we did it for a period of a week, because we know if we do it for much longer, then it becomes very, very disruptive of the athlete's life. So I think we collected like quite high quality data, and the fact that the athletes had power meters, as we were discussing at the beginning, is very, very good way of having a probably as good as it gets when it comes to direct measurement of energy expenditure from exercise. And so what we observed was that there was like a huge variation in terms of like the energy availability that these athletes have day to day. And, the range, I can't remember the exact numbers right now, but they range between like -20 to like 70, I think, kilocalories per kilo of fat-free mass per day, which is, a lot different from what the majority of the literature on energy availability reports. So one of the difference is that most studies inflict this sort of homogeneous low energy availability for a period of 5 days, which is very, very useful to see what the effects are of underfueling, but doesn't seem to be really representative of what might be happening on the field with athletes. And we see that, it's very interesting to see that how athletes eat very, very similar each day, because we were not influencing their dietary behavior. So in this case, in this particular cohort, and I would love to, if there are other researchers listening to this now, to see this in other cohorts, see more, if this is happening with other type of athletes that maybe train less, that are not so concerned about body weight and so on. We see this big variation, and basically what we see is that at least on a day-to-day basis, they do not compensate. What is very interesting to think when you think about this as well is that because there's so little variation day to day, it seems that the rest day from exercise is also a day of refueling inadvertently. So it's not that it seems that when they rest on the bike, they're actually refueling for from the following day towards from the previous day towards the following day.
So they basically eat very similar amounts day to day, despite the fact that their training load varies quite a bit day to day.
Correct. Yeah. So we see, when we running some, stats, we see that the compensation of energy intake is about, at least when looking at the day-to-day basis, and this is a short period of time, what happens over a period of like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever, might be different. But at least during the period of this week, the compensation was about like 21 So for every 1,000 calories that the individuals increase in the exercise energy expenditure, the intake increases by 210 calories, I think it was. So, and I don't have the paper right in front of me, so the numbers might be a little bit off, but it's around that.
Directionally, correct.
Yes, yeah. So, and of course what is important here, is also to remember that we are aware that there's error in measurement. And so that's why I don't try to say like, they were in low energy availability this many days. You say there's no reference in the study to low energy availability. First of all, because we don't know what low energy availability is. And second, we acknowledge there's might be inaccuracies in some measurements, but we know the patterns are right.
Yes.
So this is very, very important to consider. So when you're using these devices to measure energy expenditure and so on, and try to have a look at your energy availability, then if you see big differences, well, that is definitely telling you something. What is important, and this is maybe like some sort of like take-home message, is if you're trying to calculate your day-to-day energy availability, first of all, it depends what formula you're using to calculate it. But second, if you think that you're in low energy availability because you're in 29 kilocalories per kilo of fat-free mass per day, and then, the following day you're in 34 and you think you're safe, that's probably most of it is error of measurement. Yeah. But if you have a measurement of like 0 kilocalories per kilo of fat-free mass per day, for whatever reason, if your measurements are roughly accurate, you're okay, sort of thing. What's okay is different for different people. But let's say your measurements are accurate, and you have a 0 for a number of days of low of energy availability, then you go like, okay, I think maybe we need to look into what's happening here in terms of your fueling. My point being, if we consider the error of measurement, we can have a rough idea of what's going on when the difference is big.
Yeah, for sure.
But we cannot be sort of splitting hairs, saying like, oh, you're 5 kilocalories per kilo of fat-free mass per day off. Well, what should be your target? So this is something that we need to be careful about.
And that's really a good point, considering that a lot of people listening to this are really data driven and really do focus in on the numbers and can get a little bit caught up, I suppose, in the minute sort of details, and so taking a step back and thinking about that makes sense. Jose, you did mention in the paper actually that the carbs weren't matched to the requirements of what they should have, but what they would theoretically need if we think about what the sports nutrition requirements are. And you'll know this as well as I do, probably, that across the board, when you look at elite athletes, their intake of carbs are typically around that 5 to 6 grams per kg body weight per day. Like if I think about the published literature, when they look at sort of normal patterns of intake, do you think that has, is that your observation in general, that this is typically where athletes fall down? Yeah,
totally. It's a reason why we pointed towards that, and it's because we see again and again, that athletes are basically underfueling carbohydrates systematically. Particularly, the higher the training load, the less they seem to be able to hit these targets, which has let's say, like a knock-on effect on the energy balance, of these athletes, because they are like chronically underfueling sort of thing. So yeah, definitely. And this is for most athletes, it's a very low hanging fruit.
Yes.
And when I work with my students, teaching them, and when I work with athletes, looking at what they do, I tell them this is the first thing you should be looking at, most of the time. Of course, each individual is different, each situation is different, but this is one of the first things that you should be looking at: your daily intake of carbohydrates relative to how much training volume you're doing. And most of the people get it wrong. Why this happens, I really don't know. This happens more with individuals with higher training loads. I believe that there's a mismatch. there is some sort of carb phobia, in many cases. And in many cases, people get so focused on like eating healthy that they don't realize that the type of carbohydrates that they need to eat are maybe not the most healthy looking. Like if your training volume is high, you need high carbohydrate, energy dense foods to be able to match the energy expenditure. If your energy expenditure is high, because you have a limitation in the size of your stomach that doesn't allow you to put those carbs intake up,
Yeah, for sure.
being high. I'm not saying don't eat fiber, but I'm saying if all your food is very fiber rich and you're training a lot, then you're going to have a physical limitation in the capacity of putting those carbohydrates in.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And Jose, finally, what research are you doing right now that you're really excited about that we can expect from you in your lab in the next couple of years?
Yeah, well, we have a lot of things going on, really. It's hard to keep up, but one of the main studies that we're looking into now is the effect of low energy availability. And when I say low, it's low in this case, because we have in a very well-controlled conditions in the lab, individuals, in 5 days, losing about 3 kilos of body weight. But we're looking at the effect that it has on the skeletal muscle response.
Oh, nice.
So we're looking at proteomic responses, so that how thousands of proteins in your skeletal muscle change in terms and sort of the quality of the muscle, in what direction it goes when on your day-to-day you're not having enough energy. So I'm very, very excited about this data set. We have, of course, this is all in males. We hope to be able to do that in females down the line, but also because we're trying to understand what the hormonal responses to low energy availability are. So we have some very, very interesting data coming from this study, and we have other things along the lines of that study as well in the pipeline.
Well, that is awesome, Jose, and certainly you're one of the names that always pops up whenever I'm looking in, although your paper did not mention low energy availability, but whenever I'm in the space looking at energy expenditure and stuff, I always see your work. So it's great to see you continue to contribute to the space. So it's awesome.
Thank you, Mikki, for the invitation to talk as well. It's a pleasure.
Alright team, hopefully you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. And next week on the podcast, I have the pleasure of speaking to Diana Rogers. That is going to be a fantastic conversation, so you won't want to miss that. Until then though, you can catch me over on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, over on Instagram and Twitter at Mikki Williden, or head to my website mikkiwilliden.com, sign up to Monday's Matter, or book a call to talk about your nutrition with me. Alright team, have a great week. See you later.